welcome appears in this passage. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. That's the word of God for the people of God. Okay, so I want to talk to you about welcoming. And you know already, of course, that welcoming is important. The biblical narrative is full of admonitions, in particular throughout the Old Testament and then into the New Testament, about welcoming, like welcoming strangers, welcoming aliens, all this sort of thing. Last week, the lectionary passage that I used last week, if you were here, you might remember I said, is the reason that we have a lectionary is because nobody in their right mind would have chosen that passage to preach on. First of all, it was about that long, and it was really complicated and went all over the place and was hard to kind of figure it out. And then this week, this is just this little passage, couple of verses, 3 verses, that just says, welcome people. Sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? The difference between the two, I think, is last week we figured out that this long, complicated passage was really asking us to think about our priorities, what was important to us, and how we live that out in the world. And this week, the subject on the table about being welcoming or hospitable is something that was woven into the fabric of the people of Israel. It was a cultural value. So just like you might have things that you hold to be valuable as an individual, your own personal priorities, so whole cultures have priorities or values. Nations have priorities or values. And so that's what I want to talk about. And Jesus often says, although these aren't Jesus' own words, but paraphrasing, your priorities aren't what you say they are, they're revealed by how you live. And similarly, for an entire community or a group of people, even a nation, the things that nation holds to be important, its cultural values, shape how you live and what other people see when they look at that nation. So I'd like to talk about that a bit. Now, one of the things is that back in the days of ancient Israel through into New Testament Israel, the people had things that they valued, cultural values. But they don't look anything like the cultural values that most people living in the Western world hold to be important today. So here's my list. This is my list of things that the people of Israel held to be important. And there are things on there we may not even really know what they even are. These are the sorts of things that are so important to a culture that you don't need to tell anybody about them. Everybody already knows. Like, there are very few places in the biblical narrative that you might look up that talk directly about some of these issues, like honor and shame. And talk directly about that and say, listen, honor and shame is important. You won't find that. Because it was so important to the people that everyone already knew. It's like breathing in and out. When you get out of bed in the morning, you don't put on your to-do list, I must breathe in and out today, right? Because of course you're going to breathe in and out. And of course the people thought that honor and shame were important. They thought that patronage was important. And we don't really do patronage at all today, although the movie The Godfather does a pretty good job of describing patronage. You know, the key figure in The Godfather figure, he's the patron, right? Patron of the people. And he has a set of responsibilities, and his responsibilities would be to look after the well-being of his community. And then there are what are called clients, the people that live in the community, and their job is to show honor and respect to the patron. And occasionally to do something that the patron might ask them, which of course is what the whole movie is about. But we don't really have that going on. Torah, incredibly important to the people, as was the temple, as was the Sabbath, even the land. Of course, this has really serious consequences for the world today, is how the people of Israel, modern day nation state of Israel, view the land on which they live. unlike perhaps many of us, a land is not simply a commodity that you can buy and sell and trade with other people. That's not how they see it at all. The land is a way that you connect to God. It's sacramental in their minds. It's a little bit like the way Native American people view land. It's a connection with God. And so if you say to somebody, I'm going to take your land away, it's okay, I'll give you some other land. They're not interested in that, because you're not just taking away a piece of land, you're taking away their connection with God and with their people. So all of these things are important, and I put hospitality in blue because that's what being welcoming is about. It's about hospitality. In terms of cultural values interact with each other. So, for example, hospitality interacts with honor and shame. At the time of Jesus, if somebody showed up at your village, a traveler, and you refused to give them something to eat and drink, and you refused to make a place for them to sleep, that was so shameful that none of your neighbors would speak to you the next day, because you did something that was really, really shameful and horrible. You violated the hospitality code, which isn't necessarily written down in very many places, but everybody knew it, just like breathing in and out. So hospitality is honorable, and lack of hospitality was shameful. I'm only aware of one place in the biblical narrative where an apparent breach of hospitality is held up to be a good thing. I think it only happens once in the entire Bible, and it's a time when there's been a war going on, and the leader of the bad guys is welcomed by I wonder how much detail to go into here, is welcomed by a young woman into her tent for a certain expression of hospitality. And then she breaches hospitality by driving a tent peg through the guy's skull. She literally nails him to the ground with a tent peg. So hospitality is violated in that story, but the story is held up as a good thing because the whole nation was at risk because of this war, this conflict that was going on. But as far as I'm aware, that's the only time when hospitality is made subservient to something else. Otherwise, it's always right up at the top of the list. Hospitality is required according to the teachings, according to Torah. So in Leviticus, it says this: the alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. So an alien who comes and lives in your midst should be treated the same way as a citizen. You shall love the alien as yourself. Far from discriminating against somebody who is an alien, you're supposed to love them as much as you love yourself. Why? The text reminds the readers, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. So that's a reference to the time when the people of God were enslaved in Egypt, and they knew what it was like to be treated badly by the citizens when they were aliens. They knew this. They had lived through it as a people. And so God reminds them of that. You remember how that was? Don't do that. You're supposed to care for the alien and look after them. So hospitality and Torah interact with each other. And then, so one more, and again, this is a story you may be familiar with. In Genesis 19, there is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. You know that story? And about Lot and his daughters, and about two messengers who appear at the city gates who are strangers. Nobody knows who they are. And the idea is that they should be offered hospitality. But every conceivable thing that could go wrong does. And what happens in the end is that in the story, a choice is given between either showing hospitality to these two strangers or for this guy to protect and look after his own daughters. And he chooses hospitality, not caring for his own daughters. I think none of us would do that today, right? But that was that important to them. And in this story, in the end, God comes down and kind of vindicates the situation and strikes a bunch of people blind, and that's what happens. elevates hospitality above purity in their minds. It's a really horrible story. I don't recommend reading it. There's only one that's worse than that, I think, in the Bible. So if you ever want to make sure you can't sleep at night, get your Bible out and read the second half of Judges chapter 19 before you go to bed. It's the most horrible story ever. It's about a similar situation to this, about a woman and what happens to her at the hands of a mob of people. Only in that story, God doesn't intervene, and it's just ghastly, the whole story. It's one of those ones you read it and you think, why on earth would you put this in the Bible? It's horrible. But one of the points it's trying to make is to think about issues to do with hospitality in comparison with other things that are potentially very, very important. So, what are our cultural values here in the US? I used to think I could answer this question, to be honest with you. When I first came to the US as an immigrant, it just struck me what things people held to be important. I mean, it really did. It was like, poof, you could tell right away. There were so many things that I thought, oh, this must be really important to people in America. One of them, just as a quick example, was the notion of freedom. So I always said Americans are just obsessed with freedom. They think freedom is so important, they will fight to the death for freedom. They will fight to the death for freedom for other people who they don't know, who maybe don't even want it because they don't think it's important. They'll go to parts of the world that they might not be able to find on a globe and engage in huge military ventures that are described as being about freedom. And so that really struck me when I came in. Freedom really mattered. Today, I don't know what to write down on a piece of paper for the values. Here are just a few random things here. How about health? Is that a value? Well, if you've been reading in the newspapers right now, you might have serious questions as to whether health is a culturally held value by the people across the nation, right? It would be a serious question to have there. Knowledge is another one. So, knowing facts, or their alternative. That used to be an important thing, but now I don't know. So I'm a little confused about what are cultural values, to be honest with you, nowadays. I thought I knew once. But my question really is we're talking about being welcoming and about hospitality. Would we even put hospitality on the list? If you were to make a list of things, I think these are 10 things that Americans in general hold to be important. Would hospitality even be there? So I don't know about that. There was a time. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. The Statue of Liberty was dedicated in 1886. There was a time when hospitality and being welcoming was clearly a value, right? I mean, we put this big statue up and it's like iconic image of the United States. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. It was all about welcoming people who presumably were not welcomed somewhere else. That's the point here. But now, I don't know, it was also clearly very important to Jesus, the idea of welcoming. That passage I read you, it really says whoever welcomes one of Jesus's people, in effect, welcomes Jesus himself, and whoever welcomes Jesus actually welcomes God into the space that they're in. If you want to know how to be in the presence of God, how do you do that? Just welcome a stranger. And when the stranger is welcomed, it's just as if you'd welcomed Jesus himself, and whoever welcomes Jesus welcomes God into their own presence. That's what Jesus says in the quote. So just to make sure we've got that, because I think it's really important, welcoming one of Jesus's people is the same as welcoming Jesus himself, which is the same as welcoming God. So if you've ever wondered, how do I ever get to be in the presence of God? According to Jesus, you do this. You just welcome someone in. Welcome in a stranger, an alien, a sojourner, and God will be present. That's what Jesus says. So what does it look like to be welcoming? Out of all of the examples Jesus could have given, he gives this one. He just gives the one example in this passage. Whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones, which is an expression that almost certainly means little children, in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. So some people have argued that Christians, disciples, should only be welcoming to other Christians here. But that's not what's happening in this story here. Whoever welcomes a little one in the name of a disciple. So if I go welcome somebody in the name of the church, which of course isn't a building, it's us, in the name of the little group of disciples that are here, then that's what we do. We're doing exactly what Jesus says. And you'll notice that the reference to little ones, to little children here, of course most of us think of little children as maybe defenseless or weak and so on and so forth. The Hebrew word that's usually translated children doesn't really mean children. It really means people who cannot care for themselves. That's what it means. So this is about people who cannot care for themselves, exemplified by little children. The idea of giving a cup of cold water to someone in Matthew's gospel is really important, because by the time you get towards the end of the gospel, in the 25th chapter, you have that famous passage by Jesus. You know the one, right? I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you visited me. I was sick and you cared for me. And the people all say, we don't remember doing any of that. When did we do that? And Jesus says, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, so people who cannot take care of themselves, like widows and orphans and so on, who are members of my family, you did it to me. When you care for a little one, it's just as if you care for Jesus, and when you care for Jesus, that welcomes God into your very presence here. So the image is important. And so my question is whether we can recapture this cultural value of hospitality and welcoming that once was really obvious in the country. The Statue of Liberty is the example of that here. Now, there have been all sorts of incidents lately where people have been very negative about welcoming people. The picture on the right, I just wanted to clarify this after I showed it to somebody, just to be clear, that it wasn't the people in the church who painted that on the wall. That was not their idea to do that. Somebody else did it. It wasn't that the Salvation Army Community Church wanted to say that. Someone put it on their wall there. But that idea of like rejecting and not welcoming has kind of invaded the country a lot. And being welcoming is something that occurs in layers. It starts with individuals like me, you, and then with communities. I put church community because we're a church, but it could have been the community center, the local school, all sorts of entities, bodies of people. And then that body of people can infect a neighborhood and make it more welcoming. And then eventually, of course, if you join all the neighborhoods together, you wind up infecting the whole country. The whole country becomes welcoming. So, as individuals, see this picture? This is what you don't want to do if you want to be welcoming here. My guess is that all of us in the room have had the experience of being the person on the right-hand side at least once. I'm just guessing that. I know that. Growing up, I was never particularly good at socializing with other people. Mostly, to be honest, I didn't think they had much to say that was very interesting, and I was happier to be on my own. And actually, I'm still quite happy to be on my own and go sit in the corner and so on, and it's okay with me. But the idea of forming a group that deliberately excludes somebody else, of course, is the opposite of being welcoming, and one certainly wouldn't want to do that. And then as a church community, this idea that a church community can be singularly unfriendly is true. When we first started the university church, I had a group of sort of interested people, and we spent many months, every Sunday we went to a different church. And after we'd been to the church service, we'd all get together for coffee, and we had like a check sheet, and we'd go through and we'd talk about what we'd experienced, and was there something in that we would like to incorporate into the idea of being in church? Was there something there that we didn't like, that we definitely didn't want to do? And there was one church in particular, and I'm not going to say which one it was because that's not fair, but when we went there, not one single person said hello. Nobody. From the time we walked in through the entire service until we left afterwards, nobody spoke to us. And we were a pretty big group, there was like 12 or 15 of us, so it was hard to miss us when we came in. And they even had one of those things in the middle of the service where the pastor says, turn and greet those around you. So we all stood up, and everybody around us, they just turned their backs on us and greeted other people around them. We don't want to be that, right? It's the most unfriendly church in town. And in fact, the whole city itself, there are parts of the city that have a reputation of being notoriously unwelcoming. There are parts that are very run down and battered and blighted, and there are places that are just not friendly and welcoming. And what that leads to then, of course, if that happens in lots and lots of cities, is you wind up with a country that's not very welcoming. Whenever I show a picture of a wall these days, nearly everybody thinks it's a reference to a wall between the United States and Mexico, but in fact, there are many countries in the world that have walls that divide one group of people from another group of people. There are lots of them here. So that's not necessarily a critique of just us, but lots and lots of people have decided to separate themselves and not be hospitable and not be welcoming by the building of walls. So that happens. So here's the example, remember, that Jesus gives. It's about giving a cup of cold water to some little ones, some children. And I have this picture when I read this of Jesus being out with his group of people, and they're wandering around somewhere in the Holy Land, and there are little children playing. And this place, it's hot. It's a desert place, most of it. And you could imagine little children running around doing whatever it is little children in the Holy Land did at the time of Jesus for fun. And they get hot, and there's nothing there to drink, and so they need something to drink. Here's the thing. Often, if we want to be welcoming and hospitable and be disciples, we want to do what it is that we want to do. Like I might decide, there's 6 cute little children here, I'm going to give them all teddy bears. There's nothing wrong with giving a little child a teddy bear, probably, except if the child is really hot and dehydrated and is saying, I'm thirsty, can you give me something to drink? A teddy bear is no good, right? The teddy bear makes me feel good because I'm giving it, but it doesn't help the person at the other end. I didn't bother to ask them what they actually needed and wanted. So hospitality involves a kind of exchange between people here, a discovery of what's needed and what's wanted. I had the experience one time in Africa, in Zambia, where my daughter, who's now 21, was a little girl. She's about that big. I don't know. Well, she's still about that big, actually. So she was young, and we were there, and she made friends with a lot of little Zambian girls from the local village, and they'd all come over and play in the place that we were staying. And there was one little girl, she was just the cutest little thing. But whenever I would see her and try and talk to her, she would always say the same thing. She'd look me right in the face and say, I'm angry. I'm angry. I'm angry. I thought, I wonder what has so disturbed this child that they're so angry. It took me nearly a week, I'm just appalled at myself, to figure out she wasn't saying I'm angry, she was saying I'm hungry. I'm hungry. And we're sitting there, with all sorts of food and things like that. She's got nothing in her house. And I didn't have the ears to hear what she was saying. I couldn't I couldn't grasp what it was she actually needed, and so I was there giving her crayons and colouring books and things like this, and she just kept telling me, I'm angry, trying to say I'm hungry. So giving somebody what they need as opposed to what you want to give them, it really matters in terms of hospitality. And as far as I know, there's only one way to figure out what it is that somebody needs, and that is you ask them, right? And hopefully be able to understand their response. You ask the person what it is that they want. Who is the great teacher of doing this? It's okay, we're in church, so you can just say Jesus, because you'll always be right, and you are. In the 10th chapter of Mark's Gospel, there's this fascinating story where Jesus comes across a guy whose name's Bartimaeus, who is a blind beggar. And this blind man gets Jesus' attention. Jesus is just going along the road with his group of people. And he gets sort of up in Jesus' face. And now he's blind and he's a beggar. So what do you think Jesus might do? He might naturally assume what it is the person wants. He doesn't. He says to him, what do you want me to do for you? He doesn't assume that because the person's blind, what he wants is for his blindness to be cured. Now, it happens it was, but it didn't have to be, right? You could imagine somebody who's been blind their entire life jumping up in front of Jesus and saying, my grandchildren are both sick and ill, and I want you to heal them. And Jesus saying, well, what about you? You're blind. And the guy saying, yeah, I've been blind my whole life. It's okay, I can handle that. But my children, my grandchildren, they need help. So Jesus doesn't assume that he knows what people want. He asks them. This is actually Lynn and I, who's been sitting right here, we're just talking about this idea with working with people in communities and not going into communities with the assumption that we know what the community needs, but instead talking to people and trying to find out what it is that the people already know that they need and getting them to engage in conversation about what's needed. So, one of the things I've been trying to do over the last few weeks is trying to show how our understanding of one aspect of the life of a church influences our understanding of another aspect of the life of a church. So, being welcoming and hospitable means asking if people want something and seeing what they say. This idea of hospitality, of welcoming, is what influences our understanding of the sacrament of Holy Communion. You know that here in this place, we invite everybody who wants to participate to participate. We don't make assumptions that says, oh, so you belong to this other type of church. That means you won't want to do this. We don't do that. We invite everybody, and they get to say if they want to participate or not. In fact, this is not just Julian making stuff up. The United Methodist Book of Worship says right in it that we have no tradition of refusing any who present themselves desiring to receive when it comes to receiving the sacraments here. It's a way of showing hospitality, of being welcoming, of offering and inviting. So, when I talked about the doctrine of the Trinity on Trinity Sunday and tried to show how that influenced our understanding of communion, as we worked our way through the doctrine of the Trinity, you might remember I read to you, if you were here that day, the first half of the Athanasian Creed. It's a long, complicated document here. And then we deciphered it, and we came up with these points inside the blue box. The doctrine of the Trinity matters because we are made in the image of God. And what is the image of God? It looks like this. We're made to be one people. We're made to be together. We're made for diversity in community. We're made for equality. We're made to be unique individual expressions of God. And we're made to stick together. And I would add to that today that we're made to welcome, invite, and include. One of the things about the Trinity is it's an inclusive thing that welcomes people in. It's to do with being made in the image of God. So, would we put hospitality on the list? I don't know, but I think we should. I think it's important, and I think it would change us as individuals, as a community, and as a nation if we did that. And it's as simple, being welcoming and hospitable and being inclusive. It's often just as simple as asking, what do you want me to do for you? It might be, give me somewhere to live, from somebody who's a refugee from somewhere. That may be what they want. It could be, I'm thirsty and I need a glass of water, like the little children. But we won't know until we ask. So, being welcoming, hospitable, and inclusive would be a much better way of being known as a church community than the way we saw before. And maybe asking people if they want to be included. Assuming that people want to be included can often be a mistake. As I said, I'm often quite happy to be on my own. It's nice when a group comes up and says, oh, do you want to come sit with us and join in the conversation with us? But I feel free to say, it's okay, I'm just sitting on my own reading this book and I'm happy doing that, but thank you for asking. I feel welcomed even though I don't necessarily want to join the group. So inviting people starts with individuals. And then in our community in Toledo, these groups are trying hard to do this, to create a compassionate community. There have actually been resolutions and things passed at city council and so on about being a compassionate community. What I can tell you is it's a long, hard, and difficult thing to figure out how to be compassionate and welcoming to strangers. It's very difficult. But in some ways, Toledo has done a good job of that. If you were to go look at like social services for the Arab community, that group, they've done a good job at welcoming, admittedly a limited number, but folks from the Middle East, including some refugees and displaced persons, into the community. People are working on this idea. And then if you do that, one community at a time, eventually, of course, you wind up with an entire nation that's changed. And perhaps you wind up with a nation that says, no matter where you're from, we're glad you're our neighbor. That would be good. That's transferring somebody from being a stranger to being a neighbor. So that's important. And then finally, of course, if you can transform nations, eventually you wind up transforming the entire globe. And that's always been what Christianity is supposed to be trying to do. Like the United Methodist Church mission statement, and most big denominations have mission statements, but they're nearly all something to do with this. The United Methodist Church says that our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ, not just for the fun of it. It's to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And hospitality transforms the world, but hospitality starts with individuals, with each one of us. So that's the work at hand, to figure out how to be hospitable to people, how to be welcoming to people, how to ask people what it is that they need when we engage in ministry, and not to assume that people out there are the people with the problems and the people in here are the people with the solutions, because the world doesn't work like that. So I hope you'll be able to think about that a little bit during the days ahead. I think as a country, it's incredibly important, this issue right now, as to how we're going to deal with different types of people, how we're going to interact with them, whether or not we're going to welcome them, whether or not we're going to be hospitable to them. I think it starts with individuals and works its way up. So, all right, we are now going to respond to the word, which we do through our offerings and in the celebration of Holy Communion.